Welcome to part 2 of this multi-part look at the history of releases in The Legend of Zelda. If you haven't already, make sure to watch part 1, where I cover the origins of the series, the evolution of its mechanics, and many of its early spin-offs and oddities. And yes, that includes the CDI games. But there's a lot of big games to cover this time around, so let's get right into Link's transition into 3D. While Japan was enjoying the Satellite View and the West mostly ignored the CDI, Nintendo had already begun planning the next mainline entry in the Zelda series, and this would be their most ambitious to date, if only because of the transition to 3D. The gaming landscape was obviously heading in that direction, and a new Mario game was already in development for the upcoming Nintendo 64. The question was, what form would Zelda take in this perspective shift? Well, fans got a taste in 1995 when Nintendo released a short teaser as part of their Space World trade show. In it, a 3D modeled Link from the original Legend of Zelda battles a metallic knight. It's incredibly simple by today's standards, but it was the first step forward in this reimagining. That said, part of the story of the first 3D Zelda game begins much earlier, with the hiring of Eiji Aonuma. All throughout the lifetime of the NES and Super Nintendo, Nintendo would constantly be on the lookout for new talent, and the Zelda series had shown how invaluable these new perspectives could be, with Kensuke Tanabe and Yoshiaki Koizumi being at the forefront. By supporting this talent, new ideas could form that would push their games forward, and conveniently enough, many came from the Osaka University of Arts, which was located near Nintendo's headquarters at the time. However, this wasn't always the case. Sometimes they would hire new talent based entirely on their unconventional background. And there's few more unconventional than Aonuma, as he had never played a video game before in his life. Aonuma had grown up in the Nagano prefecture, where he would often watch his grandfather and uncle, who were both carpenters, craft various things. He took inspiration from watching them work and would often try to do the same whenever he had drafting or craft homework from school. He would pick up a piece of wood and use the tools to make something of his own, which had an added benefit, as his parents rarely, if ever, bought him toys as a kid. This passion would follow him to university, where he would create marionettes that could dance or play instruments. He eventually graduated with a master's degree in composition design. However, it was during an exhibition of his marionettes that he came across members of the video game industry and became drawn to their work. He soon learned that Yoichi Kotabe, an animator that had worked on the 1960 Sayuki film, Heidi, Girl of the Alps, and Nazca of the Valley of the Wind, among many others, had also graduated from his college and had actually worked with Nintendo to create the packaging for Super Mario Bros. And would go on to create some of the art for A Link to the Past. Aonuma then obtained Kotabe's business card from his university, and the two made contact soon after. Kotabe would eventually recommend him to Shigeru Miyamoto, who came away impressed after seeing his marionette portfolio. The fact that Aonuma didn't play games didn't matter to him. He was always looking for employees with a wide range of skills, as they'd be less likely to be constrained by any strict guidelines of what it means to make a video game. Breaking the pattern of game design was more important as a creator. And yet, after securing the job with Nintendo, Aonuma felt that he should still become familiar with the medium. He spoke with his girlfriend at the time, who would often play video games, and she recommended Super Mario Bros. But he was terrible at it, so she suggested a game less reliant on reflexes, Dragon Quest. He ended up playing it all night with her right by his side to ensure he played it properly and understood what to do. Soon after, he borrowed the Portopia serial murder case, falling in love with how video games could capture the imagination. Despite this, he still only plays games for research purposes, as he considers himself quite bad at them. As he began work at Nintendo, he expected to be put in charge of box art or something similar to Kotabe. Instead, he was tasked with designing game graphics as part of NES Open Tournament Golf. This gave him some familiarity with game development, and he was often tasked with helping external Nintendo teams, including one for HAL Laboratories with Satoru Iwata that was sadly cancelled. But what he really wanted was the opportunity to work as part of one of Nintendo's main teams, especially on The Legend of Zelda, as he had become enamored with A Link to the Past. But as he wasn't part of the team, he decided instead to create a game that took inspiration from it. Marvelous, Another Treasure Island, wears its Link to the Past influence on its sleeve, but there are elements that make it unique. Players controlled a party of 3 kids, each with their own skill set. The game was more puzzle-focused with a large amount of text. However, it didn't release until after the Nintendo 64 was already available in both Japan and North America, making localization unlikely as Nintendo wanted to push their new system. To this day, Marvelous has never been re-released, but the game accomplished something unexpected. It impressed Miyamoto enough that Aonuma was invited to be part of the next Zelda game's development, the game that would become The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. However, as of 1993, Miyamoto had different plans for what the next Zelda game would be. He had begun working with Yoshiaki Koizumi on a remake of The Adventure of Link for the Super Famicom that would feature a polygonal Link. The game would have been viewed in the same way as the original, with the gameplay mostly focused on side-scrolling action. For one reason or another though, the concept never came together and the remake was cancelled. While the team all moved on to other projects, the idea of a new Zelda game focused on sword fighting stuck with them. It was 1995 when Nintendo unveiled the Nintendo 64 to the public, promising 3D visuals and exciting new ways to play. But alongside it, Nintendo revealed a planned add-on that would function kind of like the Famicom disk system. Dubbed the 64DD, or disk drive, it would provide the N64 with additional RAM and rewritable memory that would allow player-created content to be saved to the disks. Finally, they announced their intentions to not only launch in 1996 with a brand new 3D Mario, but release a 3D Zelda sometime after that. This is where the tech demo that I mentioned earlier premiered, and it had quite the team behind it despite being only a few seconds long. It was programmed by Giles Goddard, who had previously worked on the original Star Fox and was behind the interactive Mario face in Super Mario 64. Yoshiaki Koizumi created the character models and did the animation work, while Takao Shimizu, co-director of Donkey Kong on the Game Boy, served as director. Shimizu didn't stay with the Zelda team though, as he moved on to direct Star Fox 64. Instead, Miyamoto would ask Toru Osawa to direct the Zelda 64 project, as Osawa had previously created the story and character designs for Kid Icarus and directed both the second Famicom Detective Club and The Frog for Whom the Bell Tolls. Osawa agreed, having always wanted to work on a Zelda game, and began writing the script for this new project, keeping in mind the desire to craft a game around sword fighting. He would eventually be joined by Koizumi once Super Mario 64's development finished, who in turn brought along a programmer named Jin Ikeda. Together, they began experimenting with what was possible for a Zelda game while using and modifying the engine for Mario 64. In fact, half of the development time was used to make the engine, as so many modifications were implemented that it was essentially a different one altogether. Furthermore, the team's goal was to fully utilize the 64DD and its extra RAM to create a persistent world that would save any changes. If a tree was cut down, it would always be cut. If Link left footprints behind on the ground, those footprints would remain even if visited hours later. It was ambitious to be sure, but the team was just throwing ideas around to see what might be feasible. One of Miyamoto's early ideas for the game would have had players exploring in a first-person perspective until an enemy was encountered. The camera would then shift to a side-scrolling 2D view similar to The Adventure of Link to focus on the swordplay. But Koizumi immediately rejected this idea, as he had been working hard on all of Link's animations. To have them hidden most of the time felt like a waste. Speaking of animations, this also directly led to the decision not to use the 64DD peripheral for the game, as the team would later explain in an Iwata Asks. Basically, ROM cartridges don't have any moving mechanical parts, which allows the game to retrieve motion data wherever it may be. But with a magnetic disc like the 64DD was designed to use, it would take time to move the mechanical parts and actually retrieve it. This would limit the amount of animations in the game. Not a problem if there weren't many, as they could be stored in the memory, but the team had created 500 different patterns, far too many for the disk drive at the time. This led to another problem though, as the team now had less storage space to work with. In an attempt to combat this, they created the game on the largest cartridge ever at that point, with 32 megabytes of storage, whereas most only had 16. In fact, the concerns over storage space led to one of the more notorious initial concepts that Miyamoto had for the game. If they couldn't find a way to make an interconnected world, then they could create a game that took place entirely within Ganon's castle. Link could never leave, and instead each room would lead to a different area such as a waterfall or a forest. It wasn't ideal, but the idea had worked for Mario 64. Thankfully, the concept proved unnecessary, but it did provide the inspiration for the Phantom Ganon boss battle, where he would ride in and out of paintings. Animation was also a major focus for the team. After all, it's why they dropped the 64DD and rejected a first-person concept, though that view would prove useful for when Link used his bow or the hookshot. A lot of the team's attention was paid to Link himself and his character model. Because of the desire to showcase sword fighting, it was decided to age Link up once again like in Zelda 2, but Koizumi iterated on the design a lot throughout the development of Ocarina of Time. He first gave Link a button nose, but his wife commented that all of Nintendo's characters have funny noses. Wouldn't it be better to have a handsome one? So Koizumi set out to achieve that, cutting back on his sideburns, giving him a stronger nose, and piercing his ears to make him seem cool. Miyamoto never wanted Link to lose his goofy nature though, so Koizumi made sure that he still wore long underwear. Miyamoto also felt that motion capture should be used to really sell the smooth animation, but some of the staff were against it while Nintendo's leaders balked at the cost of the equipment. Was it even really necessary? But Miyamoto summed it up by recalling that they had fussed for 3 years over how Link should look when opening a treasure chest, until one day he arrived at the studio only to discover an expensive-looking iron-framed treasure chest with a sword and shield inside. Miyamoto asked what it was for, and the team excitedly replied that they had figured out how to make the chest opening animation work. Link needed to kick the hinge first, or there was no way the action would look realistic. He agreed that it looked great, though he did wonder if the motion capture team had created it. After all, the team had started with wireframe motion capture, but soon developed their own method of motion capture, which amusingly cost twice as much as just buying the normal equipment. But Miyamoto felt there was no point in doing something already done before, as the team even discussed bringing a real horse into the studio to help animate rather than photograph them outside. That didn't come to pass though, as they ultimately used 2 footstools and a plank to create their own makeshift horse. The animations weren't the only difficulty the team faced. They had decided on a third-person adventure game, but how was the swordplay actually going to work in a 3D space? What kind of camera angle would work best to properly depict the flow of combat to the player? Looking for inspiration, Osawa, Koizumi, and Ikeda visited the Toei Kyoto studio, a theme park modeled after Japan's Edo period. But as they looked around at everything, the heat became unbearable, so they went into a playhouse in an attempt to cool off. That playhouse happened to be doing a ninja show where a number of them surrounded a main samurai. One lashed out with a sickle and chain, but the samurai caught it, stretched the chain tight, and the ninja moved in a circle around him. This provided exactly the inspiration they needed, and soon they had conceived and developed 2 key aspects of Ocarina of Time's combat. The first was termed Z-targeting, or more commonly known now as a lock-on feature. This would create an invisible line connecting the player and the enemy, allowing the player to circle around the opponent while keeping them in view. It naturally solved the issue of how the player should control the camera while also fighting an enemy. Rather than force them to manually move it around, the enemy served as a focal point that always kept Link and it in view. The second key aspect was how fights should be staged, as they followed a specific flow. Even if there were multiple enemies, they would only attack the protagonist one at a time, allowing for a series of one-on-one fights rather than an overwhelming pile-on. This added a natural tension to each encounter. From these core concepts, the team began to build and flesh out their combat system. However, they didn't want the marker that displayed which enemy Link was focused on to be an out-of-place arrow or some other UI element, so Koizumi developed the idea of a fairy companion. He explained that usually fairies take the form of a cute girl, but that simply wasn't possible on the Nintendo 64. So he kept it simple and designed a ball of light with wings, calling it the Fairy Navigation System. He then brought the idea to Osawa, who loved it and decided right then and there to name her Navi, because she navigates. This one character had a knock-on effect, as it not only introduced the idea of a companion for Link as he traveled, but solved some of the team's memory challenges. Koizumi decided that in this new Hyrule, everyone in Link's village would have their own Navi-like fairy. This allowed the team to only show a character's fairy in the distance before having the actual character appear as Link got closer. But that meant the story had to then explain why everyone in Link's village had a fairy, and simultaneously created an arc for Link. He would begin the game without a fairy, meet one as his adventure kicked off, and part ways by the end. Koizumi would also reference a list of ideas that the Mario and Zelda teams would often add to. If someone had an idea for a Mario game but it didn't work out, then it would possibly work better in the next Zelda game. One such idea was giving Mario a horse to ride in Super Mario 64. While that never came to fruition, Koizumi brought the concept back for Ocarina of Time, and the team set to work to make it happen. But like so many ideas, this had a domino effect. If they had a horse for Link to ride on, then players would need the space to actually enjoy it. So Makoto Miyanaga, who had previously designed the shifting Sandland level in Mario 64, set about designing Hyrule Field, which would serve as a central hub that connected to all the other major locations. His initial design featured a Hyrule Field that was filled with so many trees that it was a hindrance to the player, slowing them down on horseback and making it difficult to enjoy the ride. Miyanaga's next iteration reduced the number of trees, but it was still so large that many felt players would get bored even while riding a horse. But rather than shrink the size, the team decided to add more to it. Routes and roads were laid out that would help steer players toward important or curious places and hopefully prevent them from getting lost. Other developers would look at the map and decide to put a group of enemies or a hole filled with some secret to keep players engaged. They made it a point that something interesting would only be a short distance away if the player felt like exploring. But even if they didn't, a day and night cycle was implemented along with weather effects to help make Hyrule feel more alive. And that was another key goal of the development team. They wanted a world that not only felt cinematic, but easy to control from a gameplay standpoint. In Miyamoto's opinion, there were already so many new concepts being thrown at the player beyond even the shift to 3D. If jumping were added to the mix, it would just be one too many. He imagined a scenario where players would be in the middle of a dungeon and have to make a pixel-perfect jump to progress, which would ultimately lead to frustration. It would have been possible to make the mechanic fun, but it also would have turned Ocarina of Time into a completely different kind of game. Instead, an auto jump was created that would activate anytime Link reached a ledge. It asked players to trust the developers when making those jumps, while still having gaps for players to cross. To that end, the team wrote data for each terrain location, which would automatically determine what kind of jump Link would do. Miyamoto described the idea in the Japanese strategy guide for Ocarina of Time, noting how the camera will swivel upwards when Link approaches a cliff's edge, allowing the player to peer down into the chasm. But when he crosses a bridge on horseback, the camera will switch to a more cinematic side view. The goal was to not interrupt gameplay with cutscenes, but instead give the feeling of a movie to Link's movements. This idea of a cinematic camera made its control fundamentally different to what the team had done with Mario 64. In that game, players controlled the camera position as the focal point was Mario and his various movements. But Zelda mostly had the camera be AI controlled, as this was intended to provide a greater focus on the game's environment. Miyamoto also wanted the game to be relatively easy, specifically more so than Mario 64, as that would make it accessible to a wider variety of players. The game would feature cutscenes, but rather than utilizing pre-rendered visuals, everything would be done in-engine. This would not only help players feel like they're still in control, but allow the team to develop the cutscenes quickly with a small group of staff, anywhere between 3 to 7. If any changes were made to the story, they would be able to reflect that quickly, then resume work on other gameplay elements. By this point, the game was starting to take shape as more and more of the mechanics fell into place. Yet Miyamoto had one more idea that he really wanted to implement despite all the work that was piling up for the team. He wanted to showcase not only this cooler adult Link, but a less experienced young Link. This desire all went back to the core concept of Miyamoto never wanting Link to just be another cool hero. He was only supposed to be 12 in the original game and 16 in Zelda 2. Ocarina of Time's Link appeared even older despite being 16 as well, and Miyamoto feared he just wouldn't be Link anymore if a playful and childish young Link wasn't also showcased. He still wanted Link to be a little cool, there just needed to be a balance. So even though it would certainly cause headaches for the team, they decided to also feature a younger Link, and from there all sorts of ideas began to form. For one, the team could finally use the time travel idea they had wanted to implement since the original Legend of Zelda. Koizumi began thinking over how to make young Link work, if the animations would be able to transfer over and still function. And while that was feasible, the concept of a smaller Link led to the issues they were trying to avoid in combat. He was smaller, with far less reach, meaning he would be at a constant disadvantage, especially against larger enemies. But the idea stuck, and so the game was rebalanced to take young Link's hindrances in stride, while also highlighting how much more capable his adult form was. This also led to the story idea that taking hold of the Master Sword in this game would bring Link 7 years into the future, while returning it to the pedestal would take him back to his child form. It also created a moment that Miyamoto personally loved: the first meeting between Ganondorf and young Link. Miyamoto believes that the innocent eyes of a child could see the truth of the world, meaning that Link would instinctively know that Ganondorf was evil despite him tricking the king. It also gave greater weight to their reunion when Ganondorf would recognize Link as the boy he met so long ago, spurring the player to remember just how far they had come and grown. It was at this point in development that Eiji Aonuma was invited to join the team. His inclusion would mark the game's 5th director, as Miyamoto was attempting something new with Ocarina of Time's development. He would supervise the 5 as each director headed a different aspect of the game, whether that would be gameplay experimentation, scenario and planning, Link's actions, transforming classic 2D items into 3D, camera work, motion capture, sound, special effects, and the flow of time. These 5 directors included Toru Osawa, who acted as scenario director, Yoichi Yamada, the game system director, Toshio Iwawaki, the program director, Yoshiaki Koizumi, who acted as the 3D systems director and character designer, and finally Eiji Aonuma, who directed the dungeon designs. In fact, before Aonuma joined the team, nobody had even designed a single dungeon. It was up to him to create and design the series' first 3D labyrinths. He was shocked by the assignment, but he knew that only those who could produce good results were called to be directors. Feeling a sense of responsibility with this new duty, he set to work creating the dungeons. He began by brainstorming ideas on paper, working to maintain a sense of logic while attempting to constantly surprise players. He described it as placing bait that players would naturally want to explore. In fact, the first dungeon he worked on was the Forest Temple, which remains his favorite in Ocarina of Time to this day. While others had struggled to imagine dungeons in 3D, Aonuma's experience designing puppets proved a boon. He was able to visualize the moving parts of each dungeon and how each element logically worked with one another. He wasn't alone in the endeavor though, as he worked with other members of the team to tweak the dungeons and better accommodate some of Link's items, like the hookshot. They wanted to be sure that items wouldn't disrupt the flow of the dungeon exploration. This communication eventually led him to work on other aspects of the game, which is how he became the systems director of the project. Aonuma also inadvertently influenced Kazuaki Morita with his dungeon designs. Morita was one of the programmers implementing Aonuma's work, and noted that the boss arena in the water temple was a giant pool. On a whim, he decided to place one of the fish models inside, and as he watched it swim around, he realized that he could go fishing. He put in a request to design the minigame, and it was soon approved. It makes sense since he was the one behind Link's Awakening's fishing minigame. Incredibly, like that version, Morita programmed every aspect of it himself, including the music and sound effects. This level of interactivity and polish was highly encouraged by Miyamoto, as he always sought ways that they could iterate on established ideas. For example, he felt that if Link could ride a horse, then he should be able to shoot his bow at the same time and even take part in mounted combat. While the team achieved the former, the latter proved to be too difficult and unpolished. It was also Miyamoto's idea that Link could cut signposts and they would break in different ways depending on the angle of the cut. And if that wood fell into the water, then they would float. Morita was actually the one to program this, and upon seeing it for the first time, Miyamoto declared, "Now that's the Legend of Zelda." While Miyamoto's experience with A Link to the Past pushed for greater interactivity, much of the staff had also worked on Link's Awakening, with Koizumi wanting to maintain and expand upon that game's cast of strange, memorable characters. It's why the owl who acts as a guide appears early on, and the father-daughter pair of Talon and Malon bear such a resemblance to Tarin and Marin. For his part, Miyamoto felt that each character should fulfill a role that reflected Link aging up from a 9-year-old boy to a 16-year-old teen. It's why he wanted more girls than just Zelda to surround Link, and wanted the owl to feel like a grandfather figure. As indicated by its namesake, Ocarina of Time also had a major focus on music. Koji Kondo returned as composer, creating a massive amount of tracks that ranged from character themes, location themes, and battle music. But Kondo would later state that the most challenging aspect was the ocarina itself, as every song was created from 5 notes. Making each of the 12 songs unique was difficult, but he did feel the end result was quite natural. The game would even allow players to create their own music with the ocarina, as tilting the analog stick would shift the pitch. By the end of Ocarina of Time's development, the staff mostly focused on adding new dungeons, creating more sub-events, and finding more to do with the titular ocarina. It had become Nintendo's biggest production ever, with an estimated 40 to 50 employees working on the game, with another 60 or so providing aid from external companies at various points in development. This focus on polish and additional content resulted in multiple delays. But after 3 years of development, Ocarina of Time finally released in Japan and North America in late November 1998, with Europe receiving it a few weeks later in December. The story tells of a Link who lives within the Kokiri Forest, where children of the forest dwell and each has a fairy companion, all except Link. These children are protected by the Great Deku Tree, but one day this tree not only grants Link a special fairy companion named Navi, but a quest that could save Hyrule. A corrupting influence has infiltrated the kingdom, and he believes only Link can stop this force. However, Link must first meet Princess Zelda, who tells him of the evil intentions of Ganondorf. While her father trusts the man, she believes his goal is to obtain the Triforce, but without the Master Sword, she fears they'll be unable to stop him. Now Link must travel the kingdom, helping its various peoples in order to obtain the legendary blade, reach the Triforce first, and put a stop to Ganondorf's plans. However, things may not go as the kids hope, and Hyrule will face its greatest crisis to date. Only through the Master Sword and the mysterious Ocarina of Time can they hope to stop this threat. The structure of the game very much follows that of A Link to the Past, except with a fully 3D world. Link is always equipped with his sword and shield, though now he must actively raise the shield to be effective. It's also possible to assign 3 different items for Link to use at any time, though they cannot be combined like in Link's Awakening. The key difference is the amount of ways each item can be used. Link's sword can be swiped vertically or horizontally, along with returning spin attack, and a new jumping slash for extra damage. The shield can block attacks in combat, but also be positioned in such a way that it reflects projectiles, and even more as it's upgraded. Then there's the bow and arrow, slingshot, and hookshot, which all work similarly. Players could shoot them normally from a third-person perspective when locked onto an enemy, or use them from a first-person view, which allowed for more accurate aiming and discovering puzzles that might have been missed otherwise. Almost every item has expanded functionality like this, aided by a new context-sensitive button. When Link was near something that could be interacted with in a different way, the button would display what that action was. This kept the systems easy to understand. It was also possible for Link to discover side quests and minigames that awarded the returning heart pieces, rupees, or even new items. Like Link's Awakening, the game features a trading quest that will unlock the best sword in the game, while special enemies known as gold Skulltulas could be hunted down to expand the amount of money Link could hold at one time. Not all items could be used at all times though, with many limited to when Link was a certain age. For example, the slingshot could only be used by young Link, while the bow was limited to adult Link. And while adult Link was more proficient at combat, young Link could reach small spaces that his older version couldn't. It didn't happen often, but some puzzles did require Link to travel back and forth between time. But perhaps the greatest thing Ocarina of Time introduced was the sense of freedom and discovery. These had always been hallmarks of Zelda, but in 3D it was possible to explore expansive areas filled with secrets and strange characters. It also introduced races that stuck with the series to this day, the rock-like Goron and the aquatic Zora. The dungeons also took advantage of the 3D, with some not even looking like a traditional dungeon. Rather than a set structure, they could instead be a giant tree, a volcano, or even the inside of a giant fish. Each were multi-leveled and featured their own gimmicks, with all of them tasking the player to look around the 3D space. Ocarina of Time released to near universal critical acclaim, with many stating for years afterwards that it was the greatest game of all time. And it's hard not to see that viewpoint, as it's pioneered so many systems that became the industry standard. The lock-on, the level design, the facial animation, the sheer amount of things to do. It was an impressive showpiece of how to take 2D elements and translate them to a 3D design. Both critics and players felt that there was so much to do and discover, though there were some faults. While the context-sensitive button simplified gameplay, it could also lead to unintended actions. Some of the dungeon designs are also viewed as weak or frustrating, with the water temple standing out as an infamous example. This kind of reception was massively important for Nintendo, as a common complaint of the N64 was its lack of first-party games. And considering that Sony had lured many third parties to the PlayStation, Nintendo was facing an uphill battle. Ocarina of Time would be their best chance of regaining momentum, as it was one of their most anticipated games of the time. To aid this, Nintendo spent $10 million marketing the game with various commercials, print ads, and a collector's edition that contained a gold cartridge, just like the original in Zelda 2. It worked, as Electronics Boutique was forced to halt pre-orders in early November, as they simply couldn't fulfill the demand, 500,000 strong, 3 times more than any game before. This resulted in 1 million copies sold in its first week and 2.5 million by the end of the year, a paltry 40 days from its release, making it the best-selling video game of 1998. It earned $150 million in the US alone, surpassing many Hollywood films that year. In Japan, it sold 920,000 copies by the end of 1998 and surpassed the first week's sales of Metal Gear Solid. By 2000, it had sold 7 million copies worldwide. But Ocarina of Time's legacy wasn't quite finished yet, as Nintendo decided to capitalize on its success and try once again to take advantage of the 64DD. Titled Ura Zelda, or Another Zelda, it was meant to be a second quest that would contain content cut from Ocarina of Time due to either time or storage issues. However, the 64DD had been a flop in Japan, with many of the planned games for it outright cancelled. That seemed to be the fate of Ura Zelda, though Miyamoto would state in 2000 that the game had been completed. They just didn't know the best way to release it. They finally discovered a method in 2002 with the N64's successor, the GameCube, as The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time Master Quest was released in Japan. It came to the West in February 2003 as a pre-order bonus for The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker, and contained both Master Quest and the original Ocarina of Time. The game was actually quite easy to port, as it used almost none of the 64DD's unique features. Master Quest isn't exactly a completely remixed game though. The story is still the same, but the dungeons have been remixed along with the locations of some items, particularly the gold skulltulas, while raising the overall difficulty. In addition, certain items that were originally optional were mandatory in Master Quest. Critics of the time felt the changes were enough to warrant a second playthrough for most fans, but some of the changes don't feel as good as the original, clearly showing that the designs were more of a second choice. Finally, in June 2011, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time 3D was released for the 3DS. Co-developed by Grezzo, who would also go on to handle the Link's Awakening remake, this remake featured better graphics and refinements that would make certain sections of the game less of a hassle. Stereoscopic 3D was added, as was expected of 3DS titles at the time, and the game ran at a solid 30 frames per second rather than the original's 20. Rumors of the remake had persisted for a while, but Miyamoto insisted that it would not happen until those who played the game as kids were now in their 20s. For Grezzo, deciding what to fix and what to keep proved to be a slight challenge. They naturally wanted to get rid of the bugs of the original version, but many of the staff insisted that some of those bugs made the game even more fun. Getting rid of them would lose the sense of showing a friend a trick that they didn't know about. In the end, they decided that if the bug was beneficial, they would keep it. If it caused trouble, they would fix it. Otherwise, the remake allowed players to use the touchscreen for easy item management, or the 3DS's built-in gyroscope for more accurate first-person aiming. A boss challenge was added for players who wanted to test their skills, while visions were implemented to help players struggling with puzzles by showing them hints. Ocarina of Time 3D even featured the Master Quest mode with it unlocking after finishing the main game. However, this time, everything was presented in a mirrored mode for an even greater challenge. While critics didn't praise the game as much as the original, that was understandable considering how much the gaming industry had moved forward in that time. Still, it's considered one of the best remakes of all time, as it captures what made the original so good while implementing changes that made it better for modern audiences. Unsurprisingly, the game sold well, with it debuting at the top of the charts in all regions. By the end of June, it had already moved 1 million units, the third 3DS game to do so. For many, it also marked the turnaround of the 3DS handheld, as it had been struggling since its launch. As of December 2021, it alone has sold 6.4 million units worldwide, making it the 13th best-selling game on the handheld. And yet, while Ocarina of Time was undoubtedly a success, it hadn't dramatically shifted Nintendo's favor when competing against the PlayStation. But something else had become apparent as well. The shift to 3D was making games even more expensive as budgets, teams, and the amount of time necessary all increased. There was so much more to keep in mind now, and that had been made evident with both Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time. But players expected those innovations now, so Nintendo had to devise some way of getting more games out faster and cheaper, especially as third-party support was nowhere near what it was in the days of the Super Nintendo. In a 64 Dream magazine interview, Miyamoto declared that Nintendo would make games no one had ever seen. He sensed that people felt that something new couldn't be done at Nintendo at the time, so in order to combat that mentality, they would prioritize changing themselves as an organization in an effort to allow employees to try new things and energize their creativity. But they also needed to create games that could be developed in 6 months and still sell 1 million copies. To do that, they would need to finish development in 2 months so that 4 months could be spent on polish. He had realized that taking 3 years to develop a game like Zelda wasn't a great thing. It could have been finished sooner if they had actually cut some things. It was this mindset that had led to the creation of Zelda. After all, they had many 3D models that they had invested a lot of time in building. Why not repurpose them and create a kind of second quest for the 64DD? That would make the game possible in a year and boost additional sales numbers at a fraction of the cost. So Miyamoto decided to place Eiji Aonuma in charge and tasked him with redesigning the dungeons. Aonuma agreed, but realized that when they had designed the dungeons, it was done with the idea that they were the best that they could make. He quickly grew disinterested and found himself designing entirely new dungeons in secret. These new ideas were much more fun to him, and eventually Aonuma worked up the courage to ask if he could work on a new Zelda game instead. Miyamoto agreed, as long as it could be done in 1 year. As he later explained, if they could just use the same engine as Ocarina of Time and layer a new scenario on top, then something reasonably large could be done in 12 months. With Zelda, they were always trying to advance the series by making each one a step up from what came before, meaning a 2-year development cycle had become the norm. However, it was more like 3 years, as usually the first year was spent experimenting with new ideas. In Ocarina of Time's case, another year was spent studying the capabilities of new hardware. So by removing the year for experimentation and the year for learning how to develop for a 3D-focused console, it was entirely reasonable to create a new game in 1 year. And that was especially true if they started with 30 to 50 staff members from the beginning, rather than a small group that expanded over time. However, he did admit that the tight deadline ended up forcing everyone to work overtime, making for a strenuous year. Yet it was under these guidelines and circumstances that Nintendo began work on the game that would become The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask. While Aonuma had been working on Zelda, Yoshiaki Koizumi was developing a board game project that involved playing with time, taking inspiration from the movie Run Lola Run and based on the theme of cops and robbers. The game would take place over the course of a week, but could actually be completed by a player in an hour by manipulating time. His idea was to have a smaller game that could be replayed over and over. However, the game ended up being cancelled, and Miyamoto asked him to join Aonuma on the new Zelda project. Koizumi was at a loss on what to do though. He asked Miyamoto for advice, but was only told to do whatever he could. This wasn't exactly the advice he was looking for, so he decided to take the time ideas he had for his game and toss them into Majora's Mask. Together, Koizumi and Aonuma would direct the project, with Aonuma taking more of a lead as he had previous experience directing Marvelous. As he explained it though, he would be supervising director, handling the overworld and all the fairy tale elements. Koizumi was in charge of the sub-events and creating realistic depictions of the townspeople's lives. The team was rounded out by 4 other key directors. First was Mitsuhiro Takano, who came on as the script director, having previously written the script to Star Fox 64 and directed 1080 Degree Snowboarding. Yoichi Yamada, who had been the assistant director on A Link to the Past as well as Star Fox, would act as the memory management director. Kenta Usui would take the role of dungeon director, having previously assisted Aonuma with Ocarina of Time's dungeons and course designing levels for Donkey Kong on Game Boy, Yoshi's Island, and Super Mario 64. Finally, there was Takumi Kawagoe, who had helped program the camera in Mario 64 and acted as the cutscene director on Ocarina of Time, a role he maintained for Majora's Mask. Of course, at this point, the game was only known as Zelda Gaiden, as they saw it as more of a side story. But what would that story be, and how could they design something in the limited amount of time given? Aonuma and Koizumi decided to take inspiration from Koizumi's cancelled time travel board game and tweak the concept to better fit a Zelda title. Koizumi originally proposed that Link would repeat the events of a week, but it was soon decided that there would be too much for players to keep track of, and so the time loop Link would find himself in would only be 3 days long. This way they could focus on a single location with fewer dungeons, but with a much greater sense of depth and replayability, the compact experience that needed to happen if they were going to meet their deadline. This also meant that the story didn't have to be grand in scope, as they would instead highlight the inhabitants of this town, allowing Link to truly get to know the townsfolk. Another key aspect was the immediate decision that this new game would be a darker, more mature Zelda game. This dire atmosphere was aided by another concept proposed by Koizumi. What would it be like if the moon fell to Earth? That dark thought set the tone for much of the game and was reflected in everything from the scenario to the characters and even the artwork. Yusuke Nakano, who had previously illustrated much of the artwork in Ocarina of Time, returned for this new game and took inspiration from Western comic books. This was a Link that appeared to be a child but had gone through a bittersweet adventure, and Nakano wanted to reflect this in his expressions. The art would convey this dark atmosphere and mysterious mood through the use of heavy shadows. With the time loop and darker atmosphere concepts locked in place, it was time to develop subsystems that would tie into these ideas. Some would expand upon the time travel mechanic, while others were pulled from Ocarina of Time. As Aonuma would later explain, the team for Ocarina had been able to implement a whole host of elements into that game due to the long development, but he felt that there were some that weren't utilized to their full potential. One in particular was the mask salesman. Many of the masks that could be obtained in Ocarina didn't have much purpose, so the team thought it could be a lot of fun if Link actually transformed this time around whenever he put on the mask. After all, Link often obtains new items and abilities throughout each Zelda game. Why not give it a twist by having the masks be the key to those new abilities, which in turn would expand the gameplay beyond Ocarina of Time? So the team decided that Deku Link could fly, Goron Link could roll, and Zora Link could swim underwater, with each tying into the storyline. Once the mask idea was approved, Aonuma felt that everything else related to it naturally fell into place. But things weren't going to be as easy for the player. While the core idea behind Ocarina of Time had been a sense of hospitality, the team behind Majora's Mask wanted to issue players a challenge. Did they have what it took to actually complete this game? After all, they assumed that most had already finished the previous Zelda, so players should be used to the systems and ideas. While the game was unable to utilize the 64DD as it had proven to be a commercial failure, there was something else that could expand the possibilities of Zelda Gaiden: the expansion pack. This would add another 4 MB of RAM to the Nintendo 64, doubling the total available. The accessory was released in 1998 for $50, but no games required its use. Instead, it offered slightly higher resolution graphics and unlockable features. The first game to require the expansion pack was Donkey Kong 64, and in this case, Nintendo would bundle it with the game. Majora's Mask would be another such game, but while it would be bundled with an expansion pack in Japan, that wasn't the case for the rest of the world. But the game impressed when it was first demoed at Nintendo Space World 1999, as the expansion pack's features had already been implemented. Critics noted the high-resolution textures, fully 3D interiors, and more enemies attacking at one time. It felt like the team was confident and knew exactly what they wanted to achieve. Of course, this had side effects, as that same team suffered through the crunch of development for a year. As revealed by Jason Leung, the English version screenwriter on Majora's Mask, there was a night when the team finished early as Miyamoto was taking everyone out to dinner. As everyone chatted, Aonuma and Takashi Tezuka, who was acting as the game's supervisor, revealed that they had been implementing things from their everyday lives into the game. One of the biggest was how they were rarely able to go home and see their families. So many of the characters in the game, such as the Deku Scrubs involved in a trading sequence, talk about not being able to spend time with their wives. Another common phrase amongst the programmers was, "Let's not bring my wife into this," which was their way of saying they didn't want to be reminded of their home life. They all felt bad that they were spending so much time at the office perfecting the game. The saying became so common that Mitsuhiro Takano had the mayor say, "Let's not bring my wife into this," when he's talked to during his long council meeting. But after a year of this overtime and crunch, Majora's Mask would release in Japan in April 2000, with it arriving in the rest of the world by late October and early November. Set 2 months after the end of Ocarina of Time, Link has set out to find a lost friend, and along the way, finds himself ambushed by a being known as the Skull Kid and his 2 fairy companions. They steal both his horse and his ocarina, but Link follows in close pursuit, leading him to an alternate world known as Termina. Central to this world is Clocktown, though Link finds himself cursed to look like a Deku Scrub while the moon threatens to crash into the town. Though Link is unable to stop the fall of the moon, he does recover his ocarina, allowing him to rewind time by 3 days. With this ability under his command, Link must repeat these 3 days as he searches Termina for a way to stop the moon and recover the evil Majora's Mask from the Skull Kid. The game essentially plays the same as Ocarina of Time, with the exception of the new time and mask gimmicks. The ocarina can not only rewind time to the start of the 3 days, but slow down its passage or speed it up, depending on what the player is trying to accomplish. That's because every person in Termina has their own schedule that they stick to throughout the 3 days, and discovering their schedules is a major aspect of Majora's Mask. It's here that the majority of the gameplay lies, as Link can undertake a multitude of side quests helping the townspeople that reward him with either heart pieces or new masks. The masks go beyond the 3 that can transform Link and include masks that can make him run faster, are required to continue other side quests, or even help solve puzzles. There are 24 in total, making for quite a bit of variety. And that's one of Majora's Mask's strong points. While it can be mostly played like a normal Zelda game, with Link visiting each of the 4 dungeons before confronting the final boss, that leaves a majority of the content left by the wayside. For many, the entire point of Majora's Mask is learning more about the townspeople, their struggles, and how they're reacting to the inevitable fall of the moon. Some are in denial, others are forlorn, and it makes for a setting unlike any Zelda before or since. There are some rules to time travel though. Any spendable item Link possesses will be lost once he plays the Song of Time. This means bombs, rupees, arrows, and the like will have to be recollected. However, in the case of rupees, it is possible to leave them at a bank where they can be withdrawn again in the next cycle. Otherwise, any masks, weapons, songs, or non-event items will still remain in Link's inventory. Resetting the cycle is also the only way to save the game, so players will have to play for at least an hour to see the events of all 3 days. Almost all of Link's songs are different this time around, though they're more specific in where and when they can be used outside the most important examples. While dungeons mostly worked the same and had to be completed during the course of a cycle as they would then be reset, there was one new element in the form of 15 fairies that had to be found and collected. By doing so, Link would be able to restore a Great Fairy and be granted a new ability, whether that's improving an existing attack or increasing his overall defense or magic. It should also be mentioned that while Majora's Mask reused plenty of assets and characters from Ocarina of Time, the game still featured plenty of new ones, but arguably one of the most important was a man named Tingle. The son of a tourist guide, Tingle is a 35-year-old man who believes himself to be the reincarnation of a fairy. It's for this reason that he takes such a shine to Link, and is one of the few that can recognize him no matter what form he may be in, mainly thanks to Link's new fairy companion, Tattle. Tingle mainly serves the purpose of a map maker, selling maps of each area of Termina to Link as long as he's shot down from his balloon. With his iconic green outfit and Kula Limpa catchphrase, Tingle became a standout character to many, for good or ill. He proved popular in Japan, with him making multiple appearances throughout the series, with references even to this day. But in the West, especially the US, fans hated him, with IGN launching a vitriolic campaign in 2004 against the character, wishing for his death and banishment from the series. That never came to pass, but Nintendo was aware of his unpopularity in the West, leading to decisions regarding the character in the future. That level of hate seems to have died down in recent years, but there are certainly some who maintain that kind of reaction. Like Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask was released to widespread acclaim, though it didn't quite reach the same heights. Many critics found the 3-day cycle a brilliant inclusion and found its change in tone refreshing and unique. Some even found it to be the better experience when compared to its predecessor. But the sentiment wasn't shared by everyone. Some disliked the higher level of difficulty and greater focus on side quests, finding many of them tedious. Others stated that the game took longer to get into, but its highs were higher than Ocarina of Time. Majora's Mask, whether due to the stressful premise or that late release in the Nintendo 64's lifespan, only sold half as many copies of Ocarina of Time, totaling 3.36 million copies worldwide by 2004. But fan reception saw the game being re-evaluated as time went on, with many considering it superior to Ocarina of Time thanks to strong characterizations and side quests. It was considered the most underrated Zelda game for several years, though it was one of the most requested games for the Wii's Virtual Console, coming in second behind only Earthbound. This culminated in 2015 with the release of Majora's Mask 3D, a remake in the same vein as Ocarina of Time and developed once again by Grezzo. In fact, development for the remake began as soon as Ocarina of Time finished, though Nintendo insisted on keeping its existence under wraps. Aonuma was more hands-on with this version, as he personally replayed the original while keeping a list of what should be adjusted in the remake. These namely consisted of moments that felt unreasonable or alienating for players. Once he finished, he passed the list to Grezzo, who added to it based on their own playthroughs of Majora's Mask. This culminated in a remake with far more changes than those found in Ocarina of Time 3D. It still had the basic updates for the 3DS version, like stereoscopic 3D, a solid 30 frames per second, touchscreen support for the inventory, and gyroscopic aiming. But then there were more significant changes, such as how the Song of Double Time worked. Before, it skipped time ahead in 6-hour intervals, but in the remake, players could fast forward to any future hour of the current day. Additionally, the Bomber's Notebook, which tracked the lives of the villagers, was made much more comprehensive. Whereas before it mainly consisted of vague hints toward the side quest, now it detailed every character involved in each quest and where they might be found. Link's transformations also saw some tweaks, with Zora Link becoming the most controversial among fans. While swimming in the form was made easier to control, it now swam slower while using magic, losing the freeform nature of the original. Additionally, the save system was made less restrictive, since it would now be on a handheld. Link could save at any owl or save statue throughout Termina without having to reset the 3-day cycle. Bosses also saw some changes, as the strategy to defeat some of them were reworked. Finally, a fishing minigame was added to the game, which wasn't present at all in the original. While most of these updates were seen as a positive, many of Majora's Mask fans felt they took away from the unique feeling of the original, making it somewhat closer to a traditional Zelda. However, newcomers found the remake far more inviting and could enjoy the setting and tone without many of the stressors. The remake ended up a solid success, selling 3.36 million copies by the end of 2020. And it was thanks to Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask that a whole new generation had taken notice of The Legend of Zelda. But there were those who felt that classic Zelda still had a lot to offer and wanted to show players why it became popular in the first place, with one person in particular taking an interest, Yoshiki Okamoto. If the name doesn't sound familiar, you certainly know his work, as he directed UN Squadron, produced both Street Fighter II and Final Fight, and would serve as the supervisor of Resident Evil 2. It was his spark of an idea that would lead to the eventual release of The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages. In 1997, Okamoto decided to establish his own studio dedicated to creating games on multiple platforms that was jointly funded by Capcom, Sega, and Nintendo. The studio, dubbed Flagship, would specialize in developing story scenarios for both the Sega Saturn and Nintendo 64. While the company's first games were meant to release on the Saturn, that ultimately never came to pass. Instead, work began in 1999 on an exclusive Resident Evil game for the Nintendo 64 that would take advantage of the system's ability to switch between characters quickly. That game eventually became Resident Evil 0, but at the same time, Okamoto had an idea. He proposed to Shigeru Miyamoto that Flagship could create first-party Nintendo games with a Game Boy Color remake of the original Legend of Zelda as their first title. As I said, he wanted to showcase to new fans why the old games were still great in their own right. But the team had greater ambitions than just a remake. They wanted to create an entire interconnected trilogy on the handheld. The plan was to use the remake as a launch point for 2 more entirely new Zelda games afterward. Okamoto believed that developing the remake would only take 3 or 4 months, so that the team could immediately jump into making the new games while using the same infrastructure. The stories of all 3 would be interconnected, with the entire project dubbed The Legend of Zelda: The Mysterious Acorn, with the remake titled Chapter of Courage, while the 2 new entries would be labeled Chapter of Wisdom and Chapter of Power. With this idea in mind, Okamoto and the writer of the game's proposal, Hidemaru Fujibayashi, met with Miyamoto. For his part, Fujibayashi had started as a theme park designer, creating the layouts of haunted attractions for various Japanese theme parks. Eventually, he became interested in a job involving production and discovered an opening at Capcom developing video games. Fascinated with the idea of becoming a game designer, he applied and found himself a planner for 2 smaller Japanese-only titles before becoming the director of Magical Tetris Challenge. He would also become one of the most important shepherds of the Legend of Zelda franchise, directing all further Zelda Game Boy games, as well as Skyward Sword, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom. But during this first meeting with Miyamoto, he was completely nervous, later remembering having palpitations at the thought of meeting someone so renowned. Miyamoto said nothing as the 2 went through the proposal, and at the end stated, "I had thought there'd be many loose ends and had planned to strike, but it looks like you've got a handle on things. I think it's fine." With his approval secured, development began in earnest on the 2 games that would eventually become The Legend of Zelda: Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. But they went through a lot to reach that point. Initially, Flagship's involvement beyond the proposal was to solely handle the scenario, while another team focused on development. But Fujibayashi found himself drawn to the project and began recruiting Capcom artists and programmers to begin full development, even going behind his superiors' backs to do so. And yet, despite a scolding, Fujibayashi was given the go-ahead to proceed as he intended. Unfortunately for him, almost the entire first year on the project was wasted. This was mainly because of Flagship being a scenario studio. While Nintendo often created the gameplay first, then crafted the story and characters around that, Flagship began with a scenario and tried to develop the gameplay from there. This resulted in the team having to change the maps and scenarios several times to have the elements remain cohesive, creating extra work. It also highlighted that simply taking the maps from the original Zelda and porting them onto the Game Boy Color was not going to work, as the handheld screen was narrower than that of a TV. This made it so that the map had to scroll just to see an entire room, making it much more difficult to spot the elements of a puzzle like bombable walls or stairways. It also led to more time tweaking the maps. Frustrated by the slow progress, Okamoto asked Miyamoto for advice, who then proposed a trilogy of new games rather than a remake and 2 new ones. One would use many of the assets of the remake but remix them in order to take advantage of a different gameplay element. In fact, each game would focus on a different gameplay mechanic and would see the project's name changed to the Triforce series. The first game, dubbed Triforce of Power or Mystical Seed of Power for the English release, was shown off at the 1999 Space World trade show. In it, Ganon has once again kidnapped Zelda and thrown the seasons of Hyrule into chaos. Now Link must use the Rod of Seasons to put things right and save the princess. While the other 2 games weren't shown, Nintendo explained that Mystical Seed of Wisdom would focus on color-based puzzles, while Mystical Seed of Courage would revolve around different times of the day. While the team had ideas and had completed basic programming, they found coordinating the planned interlinking between the games through the use of passwords far too complicated to plan. Miyamoto had been hands-off until this point, but Fujibayashi came to him desperate for help. As Okamoto would later describe it, Miyamoto could always see the big picture. The team couldn't handle all the problems that arose when trying to make 3 linking games, so Miyamoto suggested lessening it to 2. However, this would later create the new caveat that both games would have to be released at the same time to highlight the ways they could interlink. It was when the games had reached 60% completion that Nintendo brought in Yoichi Yamada to help with the project. He had been the game system director on Ocarina of Time and memory management director on Majora's Mask, so he was more than capable of offering advice. Fujibayashi later recalled how Yamada and other Nintendo supervisors would look at characters Flagship would randomly put in the game and ask, "What's their name?" And oftentimes they didn't have an answer, which helped the team realize that naming a character brings them to life and creates an attachment between the character and the staff. It was a lesson in how Nintendo approached development, though Fujibayashi appreciated that everyone at the company treated the Flagship developers not as an outside studio, but as members themselves. However, Yamada made a point of creating materials that explained Nintendo's way of working, as it was important to find a common format that both sides could accept. And this was especially important as upon joining the project, Yamada felt that the games lacked the element of what made Zelda, Zelda. Without that, even if it was a good game, it would feel like a cheap knockoff. Yamada would be the one to truly push for the simultaneous release and the greater emphasis on the linking system. After all, they had gone to the trouble of making it, the game should put it to use as much as possible. Not only that, but the Game Boy already had Link's Awakening. Pushing the connectivity between these 2 new games would make them far more distinct. He felt that the 2 games should also be as different from one another as possible to make each more appealing. Oracle of Seasons had been the first game the team had worked on and contained much of the work that had carried over from the initial remake concept. It's why so many locations and bosses feel like they've been taken straight from the original. But Oracle of Ages would need to be as different as possible. One way they accomplished this was by having Seasons contain multiple references to Ocarina of Time, while Ages references the characters of Majora's Mask. But time was not on their side, as Yamada would often impress upon them. The launch of the new Game Boy Advance was on the horizon, which led to a lot of crunch and overtime. It's why the Black Tower in Oracle of Ages has so many workers complaining about there being no end to their toil and wanting to go home. It was something of a parody, as the general atmosphere was cozy and pleasant, with conversations happening naturally just from leaving a message. They were enjoying the work, there was just a lot to be done. And yet the team at Flagship managed to get both games done in time, releasing Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons in Japan in late February 2001, 1 month before the launch of the Game Boy Advance. They would come to North America in May of that same year, while Europe received them in October. While North America also beat the GBA's release by a month, Europe had to wait 4 months after the next handheld release. Fortunately, it is backwards compatible with the Game Boy. In Oracle of Seasons, Link finds himself transported to the land of Holodrum, where he soon encounters a dancer named Din. The two become friends, but their time together is cut short by a man calling himself Onyx, General of Darkness. He refers to Din as the Oracle of Seasons and proceeds to capture her, sinking Holodrum's Temple of Seasons into the depths below and throwing the seasons into disarray. Now Link must use the Rod of Seasons to find the 8 essences of nature in order to empower the Maku tree and gain entry into Onyx's fortress. Oracle of Ages plays out in a similar way, with Link transported to the land of Labrynna, where he finds Impa under attack. Link saves her and is taken to a singer named Nehru within the forest. But upon meeting her, a dark force leaves Impa and reveals itself to be Varen, the Sorceress of Shadows. She possesses Nehru, who's revealed to be the Oracle of Ages, and escapes into the past, disrupting the flow of time in the process. Now Link must use the Harp of Ages to travel between the past and present to collect the 8 essences of time and stop Varen's plans. Although the overarching narratives are remarkably similar, the details of the two games' stories do differ quite a bit due to their different characters, locations, and the goals of their villains. This isn't a situation like Pokemon where the two versions tell the same story with minute differences. Each game stands completely on its own and is enhanced thanks to the ability to link with one another. One of the standout features of this system is the ability to unlock a unique, though short, epilogue if the player completes one game, enters that password into the other, and beats that game. Both games build off the framework of Link's Awakening, with players controlling Link from a top-down perspective while being able to freely customize what item is selected. The items are mostly the same between games, though there are some variations. For example, Oracle of Seasons has the classic slingshot that can only be fired in 4 directions, while Oracle of Ages features the new Siege Shooter, which can be shot in 8 directions and bounce off walls. Then there's the switch hook in one game, which works like the hookshot, except it causes Link to switch places with the object. The other game tweaks the same idea with the magnetic gloves, which can attract or repel metallic objects to and from Link. Then there are the key items of each game, with Link able to use the Rod of Seasons and Oracle of Seasons to change the season and reveal new paths or solve puzzles in the overworld. Oracle of Ages' Harp of Ages allows Link to use time portals before being upgraded to allow Link to freely travel from the past to the present, and eventually allowing Link to travel between the two times whenever the player chose on the overworld. This also served to make each new land feel bigger than that of Koholint Island despite being the same size. In fact, Holodrum featured a smaller subterranean area that players would occasionally explore. One aspect both games share is the new ring system, where Link can grow special seeds to provide a random ring. Once it's appraised, Link can choose one to equip, granting him several different bonuses or silly effects. Both games feature their own trading quest and several side quests that will upgrade their items, and this is potentially further enhanced thanks to the interlink system. Once the player completes either game, they'll receive a password that unlocks an alternative version of the other. This not only unlocks the aforementioned new ending, but allows characters to provide passwords that can then be entered in the previous game to unlock new items or upgrades. Alternatively, a Game Boy link cable could be used to perform the link action. It's also possible to trade rings between games. This is all handled by Furore, who takes the role of Oracle of Secrets. What's truly impressive about the two games is that each features completely different dungeons and bosses, with Oracle of Seasons focusing more on combat, while Oracle of Ages focus on puzzles. Now, Oracle of Seasons does use many of the bosses from the original Legend of Zelda, but each one has been updated in some way, and all of its sub-bosses are brand new. Meanwhile, Oracle of Ages features both completely new bosses and sub-bosses. If both games were combined, the team at Flagship made the most dungeons in any one Zelda game ever, 16 in total. They might be split between games, but they were designed all at once. It was an ambitious effort to be sure. Fortunately, it paid off, with both games selling nearly 4 million units worldwide by 2004, with critics immediately declaring them two of the best games on the handheld. Many found them to be bright and colorful with surprisingly expressive animations and scenes. Seasons is often considered the more graphically impressive of the two thanks to the changing color palette with the seasons. Ages was commended for its excellent puzzles and use of the time travel mechanic. The two are often grouped together, but Seasons is slightly more well regarded. They've become a cult classic over the years, less discussed than other Zelda titles, but still well regarded, with many hoping for a Link's Awakening on Switch-styled remake for the pair. But it was at this time that Nintendo was about to face some challenges in regards to the series, as a new console generation brought new pressures, only exacerbated by one infamous tech demo. It was May of 1999 when the company revealed that the successor to the Nintendo 64 was in development, dubbed Project Dolphin. By this point, pre-production of the next Zelda game for the new console had begun, though that mostly consisted of the team experimenting with different art styles and rendering techniques. After all, they were still very much in the process of finishing Majora's Mask, though it had been decided that Eiji Aonuma would direct once again. Finally, in August 2000, during their Space World event, Nintendo officially announced the GameCube and unveiled a sizzle reel that showed off various games coming to the console. But one in particular caught everyone's attention. It was only 14 seconds long, but it focused on a sword fight between Adult Link and Ganondorf from Ocarina of Time. This immediately set fan expectations as the small scene elicited cheers, with many believing it would be reflective of the next Zelda game. Yet while fans and the press loved the look of it, the team at Nintendo found it to be unimaginative. Aonuma felt there was little they could do that exceeded expectations, let alone develop new ideas or expand the world. And the character designers behind the tech demo agreed. Satoru Takizawa and Yoshiki Haruhana, who had designed the characters and enemies respectively on the N64 Zelda games, wanted to create something entirely new rather than rely on Ocarina's art style. Haruhana realized as he was flipping through a gaming magazine that games were trending toward realism, but also starting to look really similar. He worried that if they did the same with Link, how could they possibly stand out? They needed a unique visual identity that would catch people's eyes in a magazine. It was with that desire in mind that Haruhana designed a much more cartoonish Link. As soon as Takizawa saw it, he was struck with inspiration, believing that a character like that would look and feel good no matter how he moved. He immediately began designing what a Moblin would look like in the same style, feeling it struck the same potential. Upon presenting them to the rest of the team, animation tests soon started with everyone experimenting with how these two characters would fight. The demo reel that resulted convinced Aonuma and the rest of the designers that this style, using new cel shading techniques, would be the best way to achieve the standout visuals they all wanted. However, Aonuma kept the art style a secret from Miyamoto for as long as possible, as he feared he would disapprove. This ended up being the case, as Miyamoto literally cringed when first shown the art style. He stated that the game likely wouldn't sell, and it wasn't too late to shift the art direction. But the team pushed back as they were all enthused by the new style and felt that there wasn't enough staff to create a realistic looking Zelda in less than a decade. While the team was passionate about the visuals, the direction of the game itself was still up in the air. Aonuma could no longer build off existing assets or pull from unused ideas like with Majora's Mask. Now his team had to develop brand new concepts, and without the help of Yoshiaki Koizumi, as he would be busy directing the upcoming Super Mario Sunshine. Even more dire was that Nintendo wanted a quick turnaround for this new game so that the GameCube would have a Zelda as soon as possible. The Nintendo 64 had lost to the PlayStation in the previous generation, so the hope was that the GameCube and the game that would become The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker could reverse their fortunes. With all this in mind, Aonuma reflected on words Miyamoto often said in regard to the Zelda series. Zelda is a game that values reality over realism. In other words, realism replicates the real world, while reality is about making things feel real. Even exaggerated expressions could be effective in this regard. So the team began conceptualizing from there. How could this new art style help with the interactivity and in-game logic? What they realized was that the cel-shaded style made it much easier to highlight in-game objects and puzzle mechanics in a way that would stand out when compared to realistic visuals. For example, they felt it was harder to convey that a wall was bombable if the artwork was too realistic. It was for that reason they leaned into the cartoony visuals with much more of an animated flair. There would be more moving parts and visual flourishes, such as strands of rope that would hang from a Moblin sphere, and suspension bridges that would sway and could even have their ropes cut. In order to make all these elements as convincing as possible, the programmer in charge of Majora's Wrath, a boss that used whips, was assigned to the rope physics. Another early decision was the setting itself. The team liked the idea of an open sea that would feed into designing the mechanics of the game world. But more than anything, they thought it would be interesting to show the sea in their new visual style. It didn't hurt that the sea also served to introduce a new style of movement for Link. Things began to flow from there, with everyone proposing ideas for what the island should be like and how the people living there would act. They next began experimenting with how large they could make the sea without overtaxing the GameCube. What the team discovered was that the system couldn't load environments quickly enough if the islands were too large, placed too close together, or if Link approached them too quickly. It became a puzzle of where they could place which island and how far apart from each other they should be. The decision to set the game on a series of islands in a vast sea had a domino effect on many of the game's elements. After all, the idea's genesis began with the team wanting to introduce a new style of movement, and that dictated a game world that consisted of a large sea with many different islands. So what did this mean for Hyrule in terms of the story? And how did it become like that? Everything took shape from there and even led to the decision that Ocarina of Time's ending led to 2 different timelines. I will not be talking about the specifics of those timelines though beyond any relevance to a story's introduction, as that's a headache in and of itself. By Space World 2001, the team had progressed enough in development that they felt confident in showing off a clip of how the game was taking shape. Instead, as Miyamoto feared, they were struck by the decidedly mixed reaction. It was so different visually from the previous tech demo that, to many, it felt like Nintendo was trying to appeal to children rather than expanding upon the edgier style of Ocarina of Time. Speaking personally, it's amusing that anyone considered that game edgy, but that was simply the common idea at the time. People wanted an epic tale that showed off a badass Link. This new Link was decidedly not that, with the detractors dubbing the game Zelda. It should be said though that just as many people enjoyed the expressiveness of the characters, that simply wasn't possible before. For his part, Shigeru Miyamoto did his best at combating the idea that Nintendo was attempting to appeal to kids with the art style. He would explain in interviews that they don't worry about graphics as much when they make a game, and instead focus on making it a high quality experience that appeals to lots of people. This was a Zelda that could appeal to fans of all ages, and promised that the game was governed by a strong sense of realism that would be apparent once fans tried the game. As for the development team, they did their best to ignore the criticism and pushed ahead with their ideas. Aonuma recalled an uneasy feeling amongst everyone, but losing confidence and becoming timid with their vision would only result in a worse game. Instead, they had to forge ahead, determined to show why this Zelda should be accepted by the fanbase. And thankfully, some people were won over by the game's showcase and playable demo at E3 2002. Unfortunately, Nintendo's desire to have a new 3D Zelda on the GameCube as soon as possible cut into development, forcing the team to axe 2 dungeons and replace them with an infamous quest to recover pieces of the Triforce. Even Aonuma admitted that the shortened production schedule forced him to improve aspects of the game, despite them feeling incomplete. But nothing would stop The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker from being released in December of 2002 in Japan and the end of March in North America. 100 years after adult Link defeated Ganondorf in Ocarina of Time, the villain reappeared, but the hero of time did not. In their despair, the people of Hyrule prayed to the gods for help, and they responded, telling the Hylians to climb to the highest mountaintops before flooding the kingdom. Hundreds of years have passed with the legend of the hero passed down from boy to boy, as each is given a green outfit matching the iconic garb. Link is one such boy when a chance encounter with a young pirate named Tetra leads to his sister being kidnapped by a giant bird, searching for girls with pointy ears. He joins the pirates in the hopes of finding her, but ends up lost on the Great Sea, only to be saved by a talking boat calling itself the King of Red Lions. Now they must join together in order to reclaim the Hero of Time's power and put a stop to Ganondorf's plans for the long-forgotten Hyrule. Despite the new setting, The Wind Waker follows the gameplay loop established in Ocarina of Time, with players locking onto enemies, setting multiple items to face buttons, an auto jump, and the like. But there were new elements as well, with players able to move the camera around Link with the right analog stick, and an expanded combat system that granted Link a counterattack if he dodged at the right time. It's also possible for Link to pick up an enemy's dropped weapon and use it himself for a short time. These are often more powerful than a standard sword, but slower and more unwieldy. But sailing was the most obvious new feature, with Link able to ride the King of Red Lions across the 49 sections of the Great Sea. Each piece of the grid contained a different island, whether it was plot important or completely optional. However, sailing was not as simple as pointing in a direction and going there. Players had to use the titular Wind Waker to change the wind's direction and grant Link a tailwind to swiftly reach their destination. Like the Ocarina, the Wind Waker can grant further abilities such as warping around the Great Sea, changing the time of day, and taking command of certain statues. The map of the Great Sea isn't filled in immediately either, as players had to find a fishman in each section in order to draw it on Link's sea chart. Sailing wasn't always as simple as just traveling to the destination either, as enemies would attack Link or natural phenomena would block his way. It's also possible for Link to attack enemy outposts and ships in order to find new treasure. Speaking of treasure, treasure charts could be found marking locations where Link could cast his new grappling hook into the sea and pull up the sunken chests. Most of the items in the Wind Waker are pulled from previous games in the series, with the exception of the aforementioned grappling hook, which allows Link to swing across gaps, the Deku Leaf, which allows him to glide for a short time, and several different bags. The Spoils bag holds items that drop from enemies and can be used in various side quests, or are used to create potions. The Bait bag holds different types of food that can be used in conjunction with animals, while the Delivery bag is used to hold mail that can be delivered between the islands. A greater focus in the Wind Waker was giving items multiple uses. For example, there's the aforementioned grappling hook that also helped with salvaging, while bombs granted Link a cannon to fight enemies while sailing. Then there's the boomerang, which can now lock onto 5 targets at a time. And finally, there's the Tingle Tuner, which activates when the player connects their Game Boy Advance to the GameCube via the GBA connector. With the tuner, players take control of Tingle and can point out specific points to the person controlling Link, and even drop bombs on enemies by spending rupees. Tingle can even provide comments on each island in the game and provide hints to puzzles in the various dungeons. The dungeons themselves are structured much like previous 3D Zelda games, though they do feature some unique elements to discover. Upon release, the game was met with a strong critical reception, with it becoming the 4th game ever to receive a perfect score in Famitsu. Despite this, and many other perfect scores, it didn't quite reach the reception of Ocarina of Time. Even so, critics found the new visual style to be impressively expressive, with the design of the world working well as a cohesive whole. Despite the change in setting and style, it still played in a familiar way with enough changes to make it feel different. Where the game faltered was the sailing and the final third of the game. Many found the sailing fun at first, but it quickly grew tedious with the constant need to change the wind's direction. It also felt like there wasn't enough variety when sailing, making even the distractions rote. This was made even worse during the Triforce quest, which required even more sailing, constant visits to Tingle, and a lot of rupees. Finally, there were some who felt the game became too easy as time went on. In terms of marketing, Nintendo decided to combat the mixed reaction to the Wind Waker pre-release by offering a pre-order bonus that included the GameCube port of Ocarina of Time and Master Quest. This proved to be a popular idea, with it becoming the most pre-ordered game in history at that time. However, this didn't lead to increased sales, as many in North America gamed the system by pre-ordering the game and then canceling as soon as they received the disc. To combat this in Europe, Nintendo released them only as a 2-disc package with the Wind Waker. Ultimately, the game sold 4.4 million copies worldwide, more than Majora's Mask, but still failing to reach the heights of Ocarina of Time and failing to live up to expectations. The first was in Japan, as sales slowed significantly after reaching 1 million units sold, as the video game industry in the country had begun to decline. Aonuma would later dub this trend gamer drift. Despite the healthier international game market, it still didn't meet their expectations, with Nintendo of America attributing it to the visual style that may have turned off older teenage players who were Zelda's traditional market. Miyamoto himself blamed the failure to introduce any major innovations to excite either longtime fans or potential new ones. That said, over time, The Wind Waker did build up a passionate audience as players became accustomed to the cartoonish art style, and this would culminate in The Wind Waker HD for the Wii U, which was released worldwide in late September 2013. While the original game's art style held up remarkably well, the HD version increased the fidelity to 1080p and enhanced the cell shading with a new lighting engine. But it was the gameplay that saw the most changes. One of the biggest goals was addressing the biggest complaints of the original, namely the sailing and the Triforce quest. While the traditional sailing method is still available, players could obtain a swift sail that allowed more direct control of the King of Red Lions, making it simpler and faster to reach a destination. The Triforce quest was made less tedious, with most of the pieces being able to be directly found rather than needing a map. Finally, the Tingle Tuner was removed from the game, replaced by the Tingle Bottles, which allowed players to send messages to each other via Miiverse. Otherwise, there are various smaller changes to make the game flow more naturally and update some of the archaic elements. A hero mode was also included to increase the challenge for those who found the base game too easy. Critics found the updates apparent and appreciated, highlighting once again what made the original so good and lessening its issues. However, as it was on the struggling Wii U console, It only sold 2.36 million units by 2022, though this version has been heavily requested to be ported to the Switch. In the aftermath of The Wind Waker, Aonuma found himself obtaining a sense of what Zelda's audience expected of each subsequent sequel, namely that they needed to introduce fun new elements that surprised the player while retaining what they found appealing in the past. The Wind Waker had failed to achieve that, especially after unintentionally making their audience believe that the Space World footage would be the future of the series. In his own reflection, Miyamoto felt that Nintendo hadn't added any truly new ideas to the core of Zelda since the jump to 3D. This resulted in seasoned gamers getting tired of the formula, while newcomers felt it was too complicated. But this wasn't necessarily the same problem in the West as it was for Japan. So now the question became, how can Nintendo balance this competing view of the series? We'll see how that turns out next time though, as this concludes part 2 of this look at the entirety of the Legend of Zelda's history. And while I thought I could cover every game in the series in 3 parts, that's looking unfeasible, so in the interest of getting these to you as quickly as possible, I've split them up even further. Right now I'm hoping to cover it all in 4 parts, but I could see 5 happening just as easily. There's a lot to cover. And when I return for part 3, it'll be time to see how Nintendo attempted to appeal to both sides of the Zelda fandom and the rise of a new hero. It's time to get weird as I cover some of the less talked about aspects of Zelda's history. As always, let me know some of your favorite moments from the games I covered here, and if you'd like to see even more retrospectives, I've covered Shin Megami Tensei, the Xeno series, and Golden Sun, with plenty more planned for the future. I'd love to hear any suggestions you might have for future subjects, and any support to our Patreon at patreon.com/gvgaming is greatly appreciated. But whether you support our Patreon or just watch our videos, it's all appreciated. And hey, please consider subscribing to the channel, hitting that like button, or ringing the bell if you haven't already. I'll see you soon for part 3 of this who knows how many parts retrospective. Until next time, bye.